but now now you have all summer to print it. Okay. 3 whole minutes late. All right, we are going to get started. We are going to be finishing up 1 Samuel this week. And we get to learn today that Star Wars is, in fact, based on the Bible. If no, which is a joke, but if you don't understand the joke, it'll make sense once we start reading because, yeah, I won't spoil it in case you don't get it, but yeah, we're going to be starting in 1 Samuel 28, which is the part of the passage that I'm most excited about because it's the weird part of the story. So yeah, we're going to get right into it. Starting in the beginning of chapter 28. Now it happened in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for war to fight with Israel. And Achish said to David, "You assuredly know that you will go out with me to battle, you and your men." So David said to Achish, "Surely you know what your servant can do." And Achish said to David, "Therefore I will make you one of my chief guardians forever." So if you remember from previous weeks, David spared Saul's life a second time, and then Saul's like, "Okay, I'm going to stop chasing you." And he did, but David, obviously at that point, probably didn't trust Saul very much, so he had fled to the Philistines again. So that's why he's interacting with Achish, because he's not living in Israel at this point. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had lamented for him and buried him in Ramah, in his own city, and Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land. Then the Philistines gathered together and came and encamped at Shunem. So Saul gathered all Israel together, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets. And so the Philistines are gathering to battle. Saul sees all of the enemies there, and he starts to panic because he's like, they're going to attack me. And so he goes to God, which that at least is, the right thing to do. But God doesn't answer him, right? He goes to all the means that he should, the priests and the prophets and everything. Nothing. Remember, at this point, Saul has been spiraling downwards for quite a while now, and God has already rejected him from being king. Like Samuel told him very clearly, your kingdom is doomed. It's going to be given to David. And so Saul is kind of left like, okay, like what do I do? Because I'm asking God and God's not answering me. And obviously, we will see Saul makes the wrong choice, right? When he's kind of backed into a corner and he's like, well, I'm not getting any clear answers to prayer, so I'm going to do something that God told me not to do to try to get an answer. Which is bad, to be clear. Don't sin. Yes. Yeah, profound insights from Bible study. Don't sin. Right, but as I was thinking through this, like, how, because again, obviously Saul made a really bad choice in what he's about to do. But how often do we, when God doesn't immediately answer us exactly the way we were hoping or expecting, do or are tempted to do similar things? Maybe not consult a medium. I hope no one's consulting mediums. But like, oh, I asked him and he didn't like immediately like audible voice from heaven tell me the answer. And so I'm tempted to take control of the situation into my own hands because is God not, like, did he not hear me? Like, I better make sure that this is going to be okay. And so Saul's seeking an answer. He hasn't gotten one. So he decides, Saul said to his servants, "Find me a woman who is a medium that I may go to her and inquire of her." And his servants said to him, "In fact, there is a woman who is a medium at Endor." That was the Star Wars joke. So Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes, and he went and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night, and he said, "Please conduct a seance for me and bring up for me the one I shall name for you." Then the woman said to him, "Look, you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the spiritists from the land. Why then do you lay a snare for my life to cause me to die?" And so, remember previously in verse 3, it had said that Saul had put them out of the land. What she says here is clear that that was not just talking about exile, that was talking about the death penalty, which, if you look at Exodus 22:18, God had given in the law the death penalty for witchcraft. So like Saul, even in, the state he was in, was occasionally, stop clock is right twice a day. Like, well, that's a good thing you did at least. You're doing everything else wrong, but you did that thing right, I guess. So she's like, she suspects some sort of trap, because she's like, this is like too good to be true. Because Saul has exiled or executed all the other mediums, and like you're coming to me being like, "Hey, do this thing for me," right? And so Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing," which that struck me particularly as I was reading this, because it's like, not only is Saul explicitly disobeying by consulting a witch, he is willing to take God's name in vain to perpetuate sin. Like he's using, like if you notice, it's like in all caps, like that means that's like, he uses the name of Yahweh. Like he's not saying like God in a generic sense. Like he's using God's name. Like, so this kind of thing is what that's the third commandment? Fourth commandment? No. This is what taking God's name in vain is. Like this kind of thing, where it's like you're using God's name to perpetuate or like to do something bad. So that's like, he's already doing something he really should not be doing, and just compounding it on like degrees of magnitude worse, because he's attaching God's name to the sin he's doing to try to justify the sin that he's doing. So the woman says, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" And he said, "Bring up Samuel for me." Oh yes, that was the reference that I made earlier. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, saying, "Why have you deceived me? For you are Saul." And the king said to her, "Do not be afraid. What did you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I saw a spirit ascending out of the earth." So this is, again, like I find this story so fascinating because it's so weird. Because it's like, the Bible's weird. Like, there's a talking donkey in the Bible. That's weird. And so, is this Samuel? Like, that's always the question that usually immediately comes up when this story is taught or read. And there is differences of opinion. Like, some people believe this is a demon pretending to be Samuel. Some people believe that it really is Samuel. I am of the opinion, I believe that it really was Samuel. And I'll kind of lay out my case for that. One, we should just start with what the text says. Right? And at no point in this whole interaction does the narrator ever give any indication that it's not Samuel. Saul asks for Samuel to be brought up, and it says, when she saw Samuel, and then in a little bit when Samuel and Saul are interacting, it says, Samuel said, it's if this was a familiar spirit or demon or evil spirit of some kind pretending to be Samuel, you would think at some point the narrator probably would have been like, but it really wasn't Samuel. But that doesn't ever happen. In a little bit, Samuel asks Saul, why have you disturbed me in bringing me up? Which feels like a weird question for a demon to ask. That would make sense if it really was Samuel and he's being brought up from the place of rest where the Old Testament saints were prior to Jesus, and he's being brought out of that back in some form or capacity to earth, however exactly that works. And then another weird part, and I did a little bit of reading on this because I thought this was interesting. The New King James translates it spirit ascending. The Hebrew word there is actually Elohim. So a lot of translations will render it like I saw like a god ascending or like a divine being or something like that, which is just another layer of weird. So it's okay, well, if it's Samuel, why is he being called an Elohim? Because that word does not always refer to Yahweh. It can, oftentimes it does, but that's also applied to small g gods, like Baal and Asherah are called Elohim. Angels are called sons of God. The term translated God is Elohim. So, Elohim can mean rulers or judges as well as supernatural beings like angels, demons, Yahweh. So my educated guess on why Samuel is being called an Elohim, one, Samuel was a judge. So it's within the meaning of the word to just he's being called a judge. As well as this is his disembodied spirit. So he is, in a sense, a spirit being, not in the same way an angel is, but he's a spirit, not an embodied spirit like we are. So, but yeah, it's weird. We should be embracing the Bible's weirdness, because that could be a whole sermon in itself. But yeah, so this is just weird. And then, so Samuel comes up, she freaks out, which I think is another point in favor of this really being Samuel, because if it was some kind of familiar spirit that she was possessed by or channeling, why is she caught off guard that seemingly something different happens this time? Right? Which makes sense if this really is, she's expecting a demon and gets an actual human spirit. But then she recognizes Saul? Why are those two things correlate? Samuel shows up and she is all of a sudden you're Saul, you tricked me. It's that. What's the connection between those two things? I don't know. It doesn't say. But just some theories. Maybe Samuel told her and it just isn't recorded. Or maybe she's extrapolating oh, something different happened this time, so I wonder if this is some sort of setup or trap or something. I don't know. So Samuel shows up. And she said, an old man is coming up and he's covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel. Again, like, no indication that it's not, because Saul sees something, whether it looks like a ghost or, like, he is able to recognize that this is Samuel. And he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed down. Oh yes, this is another example of where the term Elohim is used as like referring to a ruler or a judge. Like God is talking to Moses and Aaron, and he says, he himself, Aaron, shall be a mouth for you, and you shall be to him as God. It's like not literally saying Moses is going to be God, but now Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? And Saul answered, I am deeply distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God has departed from me, and does not answer me any more, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I have called you, that you may reveal to me what I should do. Which, this is a pattern that we've seen over and over and over with Saul. This is nothing new. He's being confronted with a very clear, blatant sin that he's doing. And he's like, whoa, hold on. Like, hear me out. Like, I had a reason for doing it, really. Like just think about, like, this, like being like a fly on the wall, like watching this happen. Like, the king of Israel consulting a witch and conducting a seance, and then it works, and Samuel shows up and is like, what are you doing? You should, like you should not be consulting a witch. And Saul's like, but I'm scared and God wasn't answering me. So that's why I called you, so that you could, like, you shouldn't have gone to a witch, though. Like, that's not, you didn't actually answer the question, Saul. Yes, and then so this makes it clear that this is like, so this is 1 Chronicles 10, so this is a parallel passage, because Samuel and Kings and Chronicles all kind of overlap at different points. And this passage, Saul died for his unfaithfulness, which he had committed against the Lord, because he did not keep the word of the Lord. That's referring to when Samuel told him to wipe out all the Amalekites, and then he killed most of them and saved all their animals. And also because he consulted a medium for guidance, but he did not inquire of the Lord. Therefore he killed him and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. So this is like Saul's been like downward spiraling, like snowball rolling down the hill. This is the bottom of the hill right here. Like Saul is completely lost it. Then Samuel said, so why do you ask me, seeing the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy? And the Lord has done for himself as he spoke by me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, nor execute his fierce wrath upon Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also deliver the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. So Saul, I assume, is probably expecting some kind of like positive guidance or like encouragement or direction, or why, I don't know, because I don't, like, most of what Samuel had to say to him was not that. But like so like he's expecting like, oh, he's gonna like tell me what to do and then we're gonna win. And Samuel's response is, 1, you really shouldn't have done this. 2, you're gonna die tomorrow. Like, so not at all, I assume, what Saul was expecting to hear. Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground and was dreadfully afraid because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no food all day or all night. Before I forget, and before we move too much farther on, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier in 1 Samuel, but there's a whole discussion and debate over like, was Saul really saved? Was he not saved? Like, was he a believer because he did stuff like this and like chased David around and tried to kill him? And like, I think you could make a somewhat decent argument on both sides. I don't have any definitive opinion because ultimately Scripture doesn't tell us one way or the other. But I think something in what Samuel says implies that he was. Because Samuel says, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Right? Samuel was a judge. Samuel was a prophet. Like, we all can agree that Samuel was a believer. So if Samuel is saying, Saul, tomorrow when you die, you're going to be with me, that seems to imply like in the same parts of Sheol as the believers were, not the bad side. So, yeah, something to think about. So Saul obviously freaks out because he's just been told he's going to die tomorrow. And the woman came to Saul and saw that he was severely troubled and said to him, look, your maidservant has obeyed your voice, and I have put my life in my hands and heeded the words which you spoke to me. Now, therefore, please heed also the voice of your maidservant, and let me set a piece of bread before you and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way. But he refused and said, I will not eat. So his servants, together with the woman, urged him, and he heeded their voice. Then he arose from the ground and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fatted calf in the house, and she hastened to kill it. And she took flour and kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread from it. So she brought it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. Which is, I don't know, I don't have really much to say about that. I just think it's, again, like this whole little story is weird, but like that's just, like, was she being really not, like, actually genuinely nice? Is she still scared that he's going to change his mind? Is she like, oh, if I offer to feed him, then he's, like, not going to kill me? I don't know. So, chapter 29, we jump back. So we've been following Saul. Now we jump back to the Philistines with David. The Philistines gathered together all their armies at Aphek, and the Israelites encamped by a fountain which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines passed in review by hundreds and by thousands, but David and his men passed in review at the rear with Achish. Then the princes of the Philistines said, what are these Hebrews doing here? And Achish said to the prince of the Philistines, is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me these days or these years? And to this day I have found no fault in him since he defected to me. But the princes of the Philistines were angry with him. So the princes of the Philistines said to him, make this fellow return that he may go back to the place which you have appointed for him, and do not let him go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become our adversary. For with what could he reconcile himself to his master, if not with the heads of these men? Is this not David, of whom they sang to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? And so they're like gathering to battle, and the Philistine commanders are like, we don't trust him. Like, he shouldn't be here because he's going to kill us. Like, that would be a really good plan. Achish, I think it's so interesting. Like Achish is the Philistine king. And David, while David has been dishonest about what he's been doing, right? Achish thinks he's been going and killing Israelites. He's actually been going around killing Philistines. But Achish says, like, he's completely faultless. Like, all the time he's been here. Like, he's done everything I've told him to. Which, again, he's operating on misleading information. But I think it's interesting that that's how he sees David. Like, even as, like, a Hebrew and a Philistine, David's not being, like, outwardly aggressive or, like, violent or disrespectful or anything like that. So this, I think, is like Jesus in Matthew 10, I think it is, like tells us to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. I think that's part of what David's being wise in how he's acting around Achish so that he can continue to do everything that he's doing. I also think it's interesting that this is, I don't know exactly how many times, but the Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s song has come up several times in 1 Samuel at this point. And most of the time, I won't say all of the time because I didn't look, but I think at least most of the time it's non-Israelites saying it. Which is interesting. Like, Saul hears that for the first time, and he freaks. Like, that's kind of the initial thing that starts him spiraling into paranoia and murder. And the Philistines and like all of the Gentile pagans hear that, and they're like, oh, David's going to be king. like they get it better than Saul gets it, which I think is a pattern we see often in Scripture, where often it's the Gentile converts who understand what God is trying to do better than God's actual people do. Because the Israelites were kind of stubborn a lot of the time. So Saul hears this and and the Philistines are like, no, we understand what that means. And so they're like, hey, if David were to change his mind and we're in the middle of a battle, and we already all trust him, it would be a really wise thing for him to just turn, what if he's being a double agent? Which is interesting because he is. That is what he's actually doing. So I think in some ways the Philistine generals are being maybe they suspect what David's been up to. Maybe they don't know, because I think if they knew, they would have just said it outright. But they're I don't think he actually is loyal to us. So I'm inclined to think, I think they were actually right. I think maybe David really was planning to do something and got thwarted at the last minute because the Philistine generals were like, no, he's not going to do this with us. So David said to Achish, but what have I done? And to this day, what have you found in your servant as long as I have been with you, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Which I think supports my hypothesis that because David's trying to advance points for why he should fight with them. Because he's no, you can trust me, right? I've been a loyal servant. You can totally trust me. Then Achish answered and said to David, I know that you are as good in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the princes of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. Now therefore rise early in the morning with your master's servants who have come with you. And as soon as you are up early in the morning and have light, depart. So David and his men rose early to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel. There's one point that I want to point out before we move on to chapter 30. In verse 6, Achish says, surely as the Lord lives. If you notice, the Lord is in the small caps, which means Achish is using the name Yahweh, which is interesting, because this is the Philistine king, but he's used, he knows enough about, clearly they know things about Israel because they've heard the song about Saul and David. But, Achish is swearing an oath by the name of Yahweh. Now, that's all the detail we're given. It doesn't say, but, so there's two possibilities. Either being polytheists, like most of the ancient world, Achish simply added Yahweh to the pantheon of gods that they already believed in. Or perhaps, again, doesn't say, so this is conjecture, to be clear. maybe he converted. Possible? I don't know. 'Cause I think there are other examples of pagan kings throughout the Bible who convert because of the influence of Hebrews. Think Nebuchadnezzar, right, after the fiery furnace. And then especially after, he goes crazy for 7 years and then God restores his sanity. In my opinion, I think not the Pharaoh of the Exodus, but I think Joseph's Pharaoh, so the Pharaoh before that, I think Joseph's Pharaoh probably converted. It seems like he did based on like the close relationship he had with Joseph. So, again, I don't know. It doesn't say. I don't know. Maybe he's in heaven. Well, I guess we'll find out. Anyway, moving on to chapter 30. Now it happened, when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women and those who were there from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but carried them away and went their way. Now, I believe I've pointed this out probably at some point in one of my other sermons earlier in the book. But this is another example of something happening on the third day. We tend to read over things like that because we don't. One, I think sometimes we just don't pay very much attention to the details. And because I think especially Western culture, because the Bible's not a Western book, and it's an ancient book, and so because of our cultural disparity, we oftentimes aren't in tune with the symbolic language of the Bible. Because there are all of these motifs and interweaving images and symbols that the Bible uses all the time. And once you start to pick up on it, like once you start to pay attention and you notice how things are connected, it's all over the place. The third day, or hour, week, month, something happening on the third interval of time is all over the place. Just a couple of examples, and I know for sure that this is not all of them, but Isaac being sacrificed on Mount Moriah. Genesis 22, it's the third day that they get to the mountain and Abraham sacrifices him. God descends on Mount Sinai after the Exodus to give the law on the third day. Exodus 19. The ingathering of Israel from exile in Babylon is referred to symbolically as happening on the third day. Hosea chapter 6. Jonah, that's kind of an obvious one. Jonah is in the whale for 3 days and 3 nights. Esther appears before King Ahasuerus on the third day. Esther 5. And of course, Jesus' resurrection happens on the third day. And so this is not a coincidence that this is happening on the third day. Because whenever you hear on the third, whatever, you should be like, oh, this is probably something important. There's probably something important that is about, that just happened or is about to happen. And so, on the third day, they get to Ziklag and they find the city is completely destroyed. Now, it's interesting, and this is one of those tension, there's not really an answer for it, but it's kind of a natural question that comes up. Obviously, God supernaturally protected all of David's men, right? Because the ancient world, especially the Amalekites, were very violent people. There's no way that they're going to burn a city to the ground and not kill a single person or animal. They'd completely destroy the city and every single person makes it out alive. That's obviously something supernatural. And yet, God didn't prevent it from happening. It's like, so you protected all the people, but didn't, it's like, why didn't you just stop them from burning the city down? I don't know. And I'm not going to pretend like I know, because it doesn't say. But I think it's important to think about questions like that, because oftentimes we can avoid thinking questions like that because it feels like we're, I don't know, if we have like we want to defend God. So it's like God doesn't need you to defend him. Like he's fine. It's like God's word contains the things that it contains for a reason. And God doesn't expect us to lay aside our intellectual capacity when we're reading the Bible. So it's like, it's okay to think and ask questions about things in the Bible. So that's what God wants you to do. Like you're not going to learn things if you don't ever ask questions about things. And so they come back, and everyone's gone. David and his men came to the city, and there it was, burned with fire, and their wives, their sons, and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. And David's two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, had been taken captive. Now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. So, because we know, because the narrator has told us, everyone's still alive. They don't know that yet. So they just show up and their city is gone. So they assume, oh, everyone's dead. So they're not happy, which is reasonable, right? You find everything you own is now gone. All your family, all your wife, children, everyone is dead. And they're like, so they're both upset in general, and they're mad at David because, you hadn't taken us on this military campaign or whatever, we would have been here to defend. So they're like, maybe we should kill David. Like, this is kind of all his fault, really. Which, again, a reasonable reaction, I think. But I think it's interesting that, again, like, details are there for a reason. Nothing in the Bible is there accidentally or coincidentally. And so the narrator is like, they took everyone captive and then specifies, like he repeats himself and says, and David's two wives were taken. Like, you didn't have to say that, though. Like obviously David's two wives are included in every person in the city. So why specifically call them out? Well, I think there's probably multiple things going on. I think one of them is, if you go to Deuteronomy 17, this is God giving laws for how the king is to act, right? Because God's like, eventually I'm going to give you a king, and when you have a king, these are the rules that the king needs to observe. When you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. And it shall also be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book for the one before the priests, the Levite, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. So God gives them a couple specific rules, one of which is don't multiply wives, right? Which the worst example of that is Solomon, right? 700 wives. Like that's, yeah. I have some questions for Solomon. But I think one of the reasons that the narrator is intentionally emphasizing like, hey, and David's 2 wives, which technically 3, because he's still technically married to Michal. So it's like he's married 3 women at this point. I think, especially if you know anything about David's kingship and some of the more particularly egregious sins that he commits, like Bathsheba, I think this is a little bit of like ominous foreshadowing, where the narrator is like, David's not even king yet, and he's already showing a tendency to want women. So it's like, hey, remember, he already has 2 wives. Like, so it's like, oh, like, so assuming like a first-time reader, like assume you don't know, like, but I think an attentive reader, as they're reading through, like they're gonna see this, and they're like, oh, maybe, like, getting a little nervous. David's not even king yet, and he's already kind of doing things that a king shouldn't be doing. So David says to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, please bring the ephod here to me. And Abiathar brought the ephod to David. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. So David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those stayed who were left behind. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 stayed behind, who were so weary that they could not cross the brook Besor. Then they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David, and they gave him bread and he ate, and they let him drink water. And they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. So when he had eaten, his strength came back to him, for he had eaten no bread nor drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. Then David said to him, to whom do you belong, and where are you from? And he said, I am a young man from Egypt, servant of an Amalekite. And my master left me behind because 3 days ago I fell sick. We made an invasion of the southern area of the Cherethites in the territory which belongs to Judah, and of the southern area of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And David said to him, can you take me down to this troop? And he said, swear to me by God that you will neither kill me nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this troop. And when he had brought him down, there they were, spread out all over the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil which they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. Then David attacked them from twilight until the evening of the next day. Not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. Now, one thing I noticed as I was finishing this is there's 2 instances of like 400 men. Like David brings 400 men down to fight, and they kill all of the Amalekites except for 400. And so, briefly, because this is how summer prep goes sometimes, you like make a connection, and you're like, oh, like I wonder if this thing, and then you like read a little further in the passage, and you're like, oh, I was wrong. So what I was initially thinking is like, oh, because it mentions that there were 400 men that escaped, and they rode on camels. So my thought was like, oh, wouldn't it be really funny if like David and his men, I mean, because maybe they were riding on camels, it doesn't say. And so they parked their camels over here, and they're fighting, and the 400 men who escaped ran over and hopped on their camels and then rode off. So that was kind of a funny mental picture. And then I kept reading in the passage, and it specifies that they weren't missing any people or livestock or cattle or anything. They recovered everything that they had. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I was wrong. But it was a funny mental picture for 30 seconds. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away. Yeah, see, I was like, oh. And David rescued his 2 wives. Another mention of his wives. And nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil, or anything which they had taken from them. David recovered all. Then David took all the flocks and herds they had driven before those other livestock and said, this is David's spoil. Now David came to the 200 men who had been so weary that they could not follow David, whom they also had made to stay at the brook Besor. So they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless men of those who went with David answered and said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except for every man's wife and children, that they may lead them away and depart. Now, a detail I want to point out here is the phrase wicked and worthless men. We've seen this before in Samuel. This is, I like how the King James translates it, sons of Belial, which is, I feel like it's just I don't know, that has a ring to it. But Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were wicked and worthless men. Nabal, who was such a fool that you couldn't even speak to him, as it says, he was a wicked and worthless man. So that's the same phrase here, which I think is interesting, because it says, the wicked and worthless men of those who went with David. This is David's band of soldiers that he's accumulated throughout his time in exile. And so they're on David's side, but they're not righteous people. And so, again, we'll see this in the fall when we get into 2 Samuel. Not everyone on David's team is a good person. Right? We see that here, but Joab is a really good example. Joab is the commander of David's army. So that's fairly high-ranking position. Joab is not a good man. He is selfish, he's angry, he's bloodthirsty. He kills multiple innocent people. For no other reason than basically political conniving. So it's just because someone is on the right side does not necessarily mean that they are a righteous person. So they're no, they weren't fighting, so they shouldn't get a share in the spoil. But David said, my brethren, you shall not do so with what the Lord has given us, who has preserved us and delivered into our hand the troop that came against us. For who will heed you in this matter? But as his part is, who goes down to the battle, so shall his part be who stays by the supplies. They shall share alike. So it was from that day forward. He made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. Now when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord, to those who were in Bethel, those who were in Ramoth of the south, those who were in Getir, those who were in Aroer, those who were in Siphmoth, those who were in Eshtemoa, those who were in Rakal, those who were in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, those who were in the cities of the Kenites, those who were in Hormah, in Parashan, in Athak, those who were in Hebron, and to all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to rove. Now, this was another place where at first I was like, I think I figured something out. And then I was like, oh, no, I don't, just kidding. So I was like, well, because David is sharing the spoil. He's sending it out to all of these different cities. And I was like, well, that's probably a political move. right? David has some kind of idea, I'm going to be king soon, so I should, start being kind to political figures in Israel so that the transition goes smoothly. And then I was like, what if David already knows that Saul is dead, and that's why he's doing it? But I think the beginning of 2 Samuel, David doesn't seem to know how the battle is going. So I think he probably doesn't know, but maybe has some kind of hunch based on how things are going for him. And maybe he's heard word of some of the things Saul's doing. He probably has at least a hunch, like, I think it's probably going to happen soon, so I should start making moves so the transition goes smoothly. Then, chapter 31. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. The battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men died together that same day. Now, I think it's interesting that, this is what Samuel has been building up to for a while. For chapters and chapters, for literally half the book. We've been watching Saul slowly spiral down, and things are getting worse and worse, and he's doing more and more sins. And God has pronounced multiple times judgments that Saul's kingdom is going to end, and now, with the medium, he's you're gonna die. And then it actually happens, and there's almost no real detail given. This is kind of in some ways the climax of the story, and it's just yep, he died. Which is interesting. There's no, it feels almost anticlimactic, where it's just oh, that's it? Samuel's basically just yeah, the battle went poorly and they died. Which I was thinking about it this morning, and I was why is that? Well, one, this isn't it's the end of 1 Samuel as we have it divided in our Bibles, but 1 and 2 Samuel is it's 2 books, but it's 1 volume, it's 1 story. So yes, we're reading it and it's the end of the story, but it's not actually the end of the story, because 2 Samuel picks up immediately afterwards. But considering 1 Samuel on its own, I think it's a little fitting that not that the author doesn't dignify Saul, because David even laments for him at the beginning of 2 Samuel when he finds out that Saul is dead, but it's almost like Saul has degenerated so far down into sin and rebellion that it's you're almost not really worth my time. You're just yep, what God predicted happened, and now he's dead. Which is kind of sobering. It's oh, Saul started really well, and this is how his life ends. It's just a failed battle where him and his sons die. So, verse 7, when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those who were on the other side of the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. So this is catastrophic loss. It was bad enough that all the people watching the battle saw that so many people died that they're we just have, we want to run away, because so not only was it a loss as far as Saul and his sons and seemingly most or all of the army. But Israel also loses territory, like they lose cities to Philistine occupation. So it happened the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head and stripped off his armor and sent word throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim it in the temple of their idols and among the people. Then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. Now when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and traveled all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. And so the Philistines obviously are very excited, because for them, at least temporarily, this went tremendously well, probably way better than they were expecting. They're like, we completely wiped out the army and we killed the king. Like, that's the best case scenario for them. And so they, to kind of rub salt in the wound, take the bodies of Saul and his sons and cut off their heads and like pin their bodies up to like the city wall, which is pretty grotesque. Like, that's kind of gross if you think about it. Like, they're bragging. They're like, we beat you, and we're gonna like display a billboard essentially of like how much we beat you. But the men of Jabesh Gilead, recognizing that was like not being willing to let the king of Israel and his family be disgraced and disrespected, go into enemy territory, get the bodies, and give them a proper burial. Now, burning bodies was unusual. Like, that was not typically something they did. Burial was far more common, but it was probably, because I didn't write the references down, but there are cases where when certain things, especially holy things, had become defiled or unclean in some way, sometimes the proper way to dispose of them was to burn them. And so probably what was going on is they recognized that through the Philistines defiling and abusing and disrespecting the bodies in such a blatant way that the bodies had been defiled. And so it's like, so to cleanse the bodies, essentially, they decide to cremate them. I think they meant it as a respectful gesture and not as disrespectful, because oftentimes being burned is a sign of judgment. I don't think that's what was going on here, because they bury the bones. Like, if they were trying to mock Saul or disrespect him, they probably would have done something disrespectful with the remains, and that's not what they do. And they fast for him, right? Like, if you're mocking him, you're not going to, like, fast and weep over him and all of that stuff. So I think they were showing, like, you know, the king is dead, we need to have a funeral for him, essentially, and not let his body rot up on the city wall. Especially because, and again, I can't recall the reference off the top of my head, but in like the curses of the covenant that God gives, like in Deuteronomy, having your body left out and like devoured by the birds and beasts of the field was kind of symbolic of the curses of the covenant falling on you. And so they recognize like the symbolic aspect behind it too. Like, if we let Saul's body rot and be eaten by animals, symbolically what we're saying is he's cursed. And like, we're not going to let the king of Israel be disrespected in that way. And that's 1 Samuel. We did it. We made it all the way through. Does anyone have any questions? Cool, I'll pray. Father, I thank you for this time that we have tonight together around your word. I pray that what was from me would be impressed, or what was from you would be impressed on our hearts and minds. And if there was anything that I said that was from me, not from you, that you would cause it to be forgotten. I pray that you would continue to fill and empower us with your Spirit and continue to conform us into the image of your Son. In Jesus' name, amen.